Pleasure to welcome you to this important discussion. EUKI is the European Climate Initiative, which is the funding instrument of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action to strengthen cooperation in the EU in the further development and implementation of its climate policy. This web seminar aims to provide participants with a clear understanding of the new EU Methane Regulation, which came into force in August 2024. The regulation is a crucial component of the European Green Deal and the Global Methane Pledge, targeting methane emissions in the energy sector and fossil fuels imports. With strict provisions on leak detection, reporting, and flaring limits, the regulation marks a significant step towards reducing methane emissions, which is the second largest driver of global warming. Today, we will discuss how companies and governments can ensure compliance, as well as the role of satellite monitoring and data transparency. Our distinguished speakers will share their insights and expertise, helping us to understand the implications of member states and the broader EU community. Before we introduce today's speakers, let me introduce the moderator of today. Mihai Stoica is the Executive Director of 2Celsius. 2Celsius is a European climate-centered advocacy and research organization from Central and Eastern Europe, registered in Romania. Mihai is lobbying and communicating on transport and bioenergy and climate policy, both at national and EU level. And together with colleagues from Center for Sustainable Development and WISE Europe, he is responsible for implementing the EUKI project integrated approach to methane emissions abatement. These guys are facilitating the development of integrated methane mitigation plans by providing representatives from government, industry, civil society, and research in Lithuania, Poland, and Romania with knowledge, tools, guidelines, and tailor-made policy options. And we are very much looking forward also to learn from this project today. Mihai, over to you, and I wish everyone a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Hi, Elsa. I think you got my older bio, maybe. So now I'm also working on methane for since 2021, I guess, specifically the EU Methane Regulation with our partners, whom I want to thank. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank our partners and our speakers for agreeing to share with us some of their insights into the not only the provision but the context of the EU Methane Regulation. It's going to be a bit of heavy content for people who are not aware of anything. So I've asked the speakers to sort of keep it light. We're going to start with an introduction into the context of the EU Methane Regulation, and then we'll get some insights on detection technologies, specifically satellites. We'll look at the respective sectors, and which for the EU Methane Regulation are oil and gas and coal separately. And then finally, at the end, we'll look at some I will be looking at the implementation of the methane regulation from Romania's perspective, but also this will probably apply to other member states. So without further ado, I will give it over to Raul, President of 2Celsius, who will introduce us to the context of the appearance coming into being of the EU Methane Regulation. Raul?
Thank you, Mishu. I'm gonna have to run through it because it's a lot, and I have to say it all probably. But the whole idea is that before rules, laws, and regulations, there were industries' efforts to actually reduce emissions. So it was very interesting that in the EU, or something to aim at European impact, most efforts to reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas industry only so far existed. So there were initiatives popping up pretty much in the recent years. Everything is happening recently, with some exceptions probably in North America. So the first one was the gas infrastructure. We can go to the second slide and stay there for the next 7 minutes. So the first one was the Gas Infrastructure Europe with GIE and the Marco Gas report in 2019. So that was basically a consortium of companies which was led by GIE and Marco Gas, obviously. And they published a report outlining the potential that industry contributions to methane emissions reductions can be. So this report is the first of a kind, and it's basically an overview of industry's efforts to reduce methane emissions. It was presented at the Madrid Gas Regulatory Forum in 5 years ago, in 2019. Then the second one, Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, the OGMP 2.0. Well, this is a reporting framework that everybody here knows big time about it. Basically, this framework was developed by a group of companies that established a standardized methodology for measuring and reporting methane emissions. The participating companies voluntarily report their annual emissions with data made publicly available through the IMEO annual report. And finally, the third, the Methane Guiding Principles Initiative. Well, this one provided training to raise awareness among oil and gas companies only, again, and shared best practices and advocated for policies and regulations aimed at reducing methane emissions. Now, probably the most important thing that that basically is governing us at the global level is the Global Methane Pledge. We're not supposed to talk about it too much, but I'm just going to mention very briefly what it is. It's a joint EU-US initiative launched during COP in Glasgow, COP26. And the goal of reducing man-made methane emissions by 30% compared to 2020 by 2030. So more than 100 companies have signed the not countries, sorry, more than 100 companies has signed the pledge. I mean, a lot more than 100 signed the pledge, and they're representing more than half of global methane emissions. The signatories have committed to improving methane quantification methodologies, particularly for high emission sources. However, the absence of major methane emitters, such as Australia, China, India, and of course, Russia, combined with a lack of formal progress tracking mechanisms, limited the effectiveness of this pledge. Currently, the initiative, however, is improving significantly. Of a very interesting facet of all this would be the methane policies in the world, so outside the EU. It would be interesting to mention several regions, but particularly North America. They have they implemented methane reduction policies, especially a pretty famous one in 2016, US, Canada, and Mexico set a joint goal to reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sector by 40 to 45% by 2025, compared to their levels. I think the levels at the time were considered 2012. Anyway, despite the rollback of US federal regulations in 2020, several states, American states, including Colorado and New Mexico, continue to regulate methane emissions. Then outside of the EU, Norway, they have economic instruments like taxes and environmental charges, and they're used to mitigate methane emissions. Additionally, some jurisdictions in North America, again, such as Quebec and California, again, they include methane emissions in their cap and trade programs. And so this is how they form the CO2 price. While other states allow the generation of offset credits through methane mitigation projects, especially in agriculture. I forgot the states, but some American states. Okay, now the final step is the EU methane policy altogether. It starts with the EU methane strategy and the proposed regulation that it's already into force, and they're central to the EU's policy on methane emissions. It was October 2020 when the European Commission introduced an updated methane strategy with a goal of reducing methane emissions by 30 to 37%, with a base year of 2005 until 2030. I'm mixing them like hell. Sorry about that. The strategy focuses on emissions from agriculture, from waste, energy, and emphasizes improved measurements, reporting, and monitoring. They use initiatives like OGMP 2.0, as I mentioned, and satellite data from the Copernicus program of the EU. It also outlines actions for tackling emissions in the agriculture and waste sectors, which account for 53 and 26% respectively, emissions. The strategy highlights the external dimension of methane reduction. It's given the EU's role as a major natural gas importer, and this is a very important facet of all this. The proposed actions include creating an international methane emission observatory and cooperating with global energy buyers and suppliers to address methane emission from imported gas, which are estimated to be 3 to 8, probably 10 times higher than emissions within the EU borders. And this leads us to the methane regulation. We can put the last slide. It started in December 2021. The European Commission proposed a regulation on methane emissions in the energy sector. This regulation introduced mandatory measures for measures for monitoring, reporting, and reducing methane emissions, including regular leak detection and repair, the famous LDAR, and restrictions on venting and flaring. It also sought to enhance transparency on methane emissions from fossil fuel imports by creating a methane transparency database and a global methane monitoring tool. The regulation has imposed new obligations on oil and gas operators, coal mine operators, and member states with regard to quantification, monitoring, reporting, verification, and mitigation of emissions associated with the extraction, with the transport, and with the end use of fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. It also phases in requirements on energy importers with regards to methane emissions associated with crude oil, natural gas, and coal placed on the union market, starting with transparency requirements, monitoring, reporting, and verification, MRV, equivalence, and maximum methane intensity of fossil fuel production. Now, I'm going to go very shortly through the big chapters, so to say. So the oil and gas is the first one. The regulation introduces 3 types of obligations for oil and gas operators. I'm saying this because it's very important for the implementation of it. So oil and gas, what are we supposed to do article by article? We have to do quantification, monitoring, reporting, and verification, the QMRV of emissions. We have to mitigate the emissions with 2 substacks, and that are general mitigation obligation to prevent and minimize methane emissions, and leak detection and repair, LDAR. Oh, sorry, not 2, 3. And the third one is venting and flaring, restrictions, reporting, flaring efficiency requirements. So 2 articles there, 3 articles. Then the quantification and mitigation of emissions from inactive, temporarily plugged, and permanently plugged and abandoned oil and gas wells are very important to mention in the last article that deals with it. Now, we're going to have to tackle coal mines as well. So the regulation introduces 3 types of obligations for coal mine operators. These are monitoring, reporting, and verification of emissions at active underground and surface coal mines. It's always this first one. Venting and flaring and reporting and VNF events at active underground coal mines. And finally, monitoring and mitigation of emissions from closed and abandoned underground coal mines. So the regulation requires continuous source level direct measurement and quantification emissions at underground mines from 2 major sources: venting from ventilation shafts and venting and flaring from drainage. It brings about obligations for member states. Do I still have time, Mihai? Can you?
I was just writing, so
sorry
try
about
to
that.
wrap it
I'm
up.
finishing. So obligations for the member states, this is it. Member states are basically tasked with the implementation of the regulation. That means that they will be responsible, among other things, to designating at least 1 competent authority, and that ensures that the authority has adequate financial means to fulfill its obligations. All these are ensuring that certification accreditation schemes or equivalent schemes are well put. They lay down the rules on penalties and publishing annual information on the type and the size of penalties under the regulation, etc. it is very important, and I'm finishing with this. I'm not going for obligations for importers because it's going to take more time, at least 10 months, 9 to 10 months before we actually do something about it by law. So there are, though, because 2 Celsius is really interested in that, and Mihai, we work on it big time, is the specific obligations with regards to inactive wells and coal mines. And that is that if an operator is not known or not able to fulfill obligations, in that case, member states will need to assume the role of an operator under the law, under the regulation. And it has to establish, maintain, updates, and make an inventory on inactive or temporarily plugged and permanently plugged and abandoned oil and gas wells, and they have to maintain and update the mitigation of it. I will have a little more, but I guess it's good to stop here. The key institutions are pretty clear. This is also very important at the regulation, but that's, again, we're in this grace period because only in 10 months we're going to have them decided. So basically, most probably, we will have to deal with national regulatory authorities, as competent authorities. Thank you. Sorry for being so long.
All right. Thanks, Raul. So just to sum it up, methane has been talked about basically very recently, and regulations have also been very recent. So as you can see, basically in the 2010s, we have the first regulation at international levels. And then before that, basically we had operators laying the groundwork for reporting and improving their operations in terms of methane emissions. All right, now we're gonna delve into some of we're going to talk about data for short, and we're going to talk about detection technologies, mainly satellites. Elisabeth Lemaître is here, and he will take us through, is that a quote, the new era of data transparency? I think it is, because satellites will play a very important role, not only, well, at the international level, but also within the EU Methane Regulation. It's written there black on white. So again, I will let Elisabeth introduce us into these detection technologies, and then if you have any questions at the end of the presentation, we have a couple of minutes for maybe 1 or 2 questions that Elisabeth can answer. And just so you know, we'll have more time at the end of our presentations. Elisabeth, take it away.
Thank you, Mihai. Good morning, everyone. I am Elisabeth Lemaître, and I am a senior analyst for the Environmental Defense Fund. And as Mihai said, I am very happy to present to you all the role of satellites and data transparency in the implementation of the EU Methane Regulation. Just speak up if there's any issue with my slides, please. So a first point that I think, first point that I think needs to be highlighted and a bit investigated is that we always speak of measuring methane emissions and why it's important to measure and monitor methane emissions, but also the question that naturally arises from this is why is it actually so important to measure emissions, and why is it important to have empirical and accurate data? So to look back at how things were done historically, methane emissions inventories were historically based on outdated generic emission factors, which led to inaccurate estimates for emissions and inaccurate inventories, and eventually arbitrary and inefficient policies. Indeed, if you base your policy on a methane volume that is very far from the truth, and if you actually don't know from which sources your methane is being emitted, then your policies will eventually be inefficient, of course. And why were these emission factors not actually producing proper estimates? It's because methane emissions depend on so many factors. They can depend on geography, fuel type, practices, even of individual operators, and many more factors. So this led to the realization that there's actually a need to measure methane emissions. So what type of measurements are there? There are so many scales of measurements that are important. There's source level measurements, also called bottom up, where you measure emissions at the level of individual sources. Can be a wellhead, can be a valve in your well site. There's site level, and which is at the facility level, and regional measurements, which are all part of the top-down approach. Bottom-up measurements, which were the most common in industry and the most commonly carried out, also historically, have been shown to actually underestimate total emissions. So it is crucial in order to get a comprehensive and accurate picture of methane emissions to actually reconcile several scales of measurements. So yeah, multi-scale measurements are absolutely necessary to obtain a clear and accurate picture of global methane emissions and therefore lead to targeted and efficient policies. Now let's get into the heat of the topic. So, we need measurements. What type of measurements do we have access to, or will we have access to very soon? So I will first introduce the first two satellites I'll give a spotlight to during the presentation. So MethaneSat is the first satellite ever funded and launched by a nonprofit, our very own Environmental Defense Fund, with partners that include Harvard School of Engineering, Bell Aerospace, SpaceX, etc. MethaneSat's aim is to bridge the data gap in global methane emissions. I will say a few more words on this later. But first, let's have a look at the current satellite constellation. There are already existing satellites that monitor methane emissions from space. Some names that might sound familiar include GOSAT, TROPOMI in the area Flux Mappers, or PRISMA, EMET, GHGSat in point source imagers. So the question could be, what does MethaneSat bring actually to the table? So far there had been global mapping satellites and local mapping satellites, basically, as you can see in the tables on the right here. So global mappers such as TROPOMI and GOSAT will give an estimate for methane emissions over a large region. It could be, US state, or could be a country, etc. While local mappers will quantify specific methane plumes that are being emitted from, individual facilities and are actually able to trace back the emissions from those specific facilities. And where MethaneSat comes in is to provide us with data right in between those two different types of satellites. So we are calling it area mapping, and MethaneSat is supposed to fill a gap in understanding methane emissions at a regional scale. Regional here meaning targets of 200 square kilometers by 200, just 200 square kilometers. So MethaneSat's goal is to quantify methane emission rates from at least 80% of global oil and gas production regions. It will look at other sectors such as agriculture and urban, but please keep in mind that the priority is given to oil and gas. The targets are 200 square kilometers. MethaneSat will revisit them every 3 to 4 days. And here on the map, you can see a sneak peek of basically where we expect MethaneSat to look at, but this is not final. And obviously, I am guessing that what is interesting to you all is, where is MethaneSat going to look in Europe? Of course, I cannot say things for certain as of now. We know for sure that MethaneSat has a few targets over Romania. So Romania will be a very interesting place when it comes to monitoring methane emissions. Targets are potentially expected also above Italy, Netherlands, maybe other places. Bear in mind that if it's offshore oil and gas production, we expect estimates to actually come up a bit later, since it's harder to quantify emissions from offshore for satellites. Now let's introduce quickly MethaneSat data products, which will be publicly available on a MethaneSat data platform. We'll have total regional emissions on the 200 square kilometer target, area source emissions, which are the small pixels that you can see here, and some high emitting point sources, which is joining the capabilities of point source imagers. MethaneSat has a rather high detection limit, so has less capabilities than a lot of point source imagers when it comes to actually quantifying specific methane plumes. But this brings me to the second satellite. I wanted to introduce the Tanager-1, another satellite that was enabled by a nonprofit, the US nonprofit Carbon Mapper, launched very recently on August 16th of this year. Its detection limit is of about 100 kilos per hour, can get even lower than this in some conditions. And its data will also be available on a publicly available on the Carbon Mapper data platform. So both satellites funded by NGOs will give us fully transparent and publicly available data, which was in the past not the case. Considering that a lot of satellites were only giving us concentration data instead of emission rates data, which is the data that is actually actionable, and also were not necessarily publicly available. Just a very quick, very few words on the meaning of a detection limit of 100 kilos per hour, since it might seem a bit blurry. So point source imagers such as Tanager-1 are very efficient at detecting high emitting methane sources and lead to their mitigation through quick dispatch action. So you will know from which facility a plume is coming, and therefore can trigger a dispatch action by reaching out to the operator and trying to mitigate the emissions as fast as possible. But if it has a 100 kilos per hour detection threshold, that means that there are some emissions that are actually below this emission rate and that will not be detected. So a question could be, what is the proportion of emissions that is actually captured by point source images, and does a substantial part remain undetected? I will try to not get into too much math here. So let's just say that different sites in the oil and gas industry will emit differently. It goes without saying that a well site will normally emit much less than a processing plant, which has so many different potential sources. So we have a statistical approach to estimating emissions. So a statistical assessment of emissions from different sites will allow us to build curves like shown on this graph on the right. Here, for instance, showing the proportion of emissions coming from different from sites emitting at different rates for well sites in Alberta, Canada, Permian, US, and oil sites in Romania, as compared to from sites such as compressor stations or processing plants. Okay, I know it sounds complicated, but just bear in mind that we can use such curves to know what's the proportion of emissions that are actually above 100 kilos per hour and will be detected by the satellites. So, for instance, for Romania oil well, we can estimate that approximately 22% of emissions will come from sites that will be detected by Tanager-1. For US compressor stations, it's closer to 70%. So to not go into too much detail, let's just keep in mind that point source imagers are generally not used to inform inventory, since they lack some sort of completeness. They will only capture a portion of the emissions, but they can truly lead to substantial mitigation when incorporated into super emitters detection frameworks. Which brings us to what we're actually interested in here, which is where are satellites really needed to ensure a proper implementation of the EU Methane Regulation. So, of course, there are the monitoring and reporting requirements. So satellites like MethaneSat can be used to verify reports aggregated at the regional level. Of course, it needs to be in the member states where MethaneSat has targets. So, for instance, Romania for now. This will, of course, lead to improved, more accurate emissions inventories. And also for member states where MethaneSat does not have a target, MethaneSat and other satellites can also be used to verify operator reports that are associated with imports, because it might actually have targets in the countries from which the EU is importing. But that is for another presentation. There is the super emitters rapid response mechanism as part of the EU Methane Regulation as well. Article 31 is mentioning it. And for this one, point source imagers like Tanager-1 should feed into the mechanism and help mitigate the highest emissions. And of course, there is also this idea of general monitoring. So MethaneSat, for instance, will inform regional levels of emissions in Romania and potentially, Italy, Netherlands, etc., and their temporal variation. And meaning that we will know, for instance, if there's a seasonal variation of emissions from targets in Romania, but we will also be able to monitor if the EU methane regulation will actually lead to a substantial reduction of emissions, which is something that was absolutely impossible before such satellites were actually launched. So this will allow policymakers to track the efficiency of their policies and base their decisions on empirical data. So very, very quickly, here is a timeline of the measurement and monitoring provisions in the EU methane regulation. I've highlighted some of the provisions where we can see MethaneSat actually coming in with a verifier role. So we're seeing that domestic MRV, when it starts incorporating site level emissions, will definitely be verified with MethaneSat, and importer requirements can also, of course, incorporate MethaneSat and use it as a verifier. For earlier provisions, for instance, reporting from coal mines or reporting of domestic MRV at the source level, we actually foresee potentially other independent data to actually come in here. Just a quick few words on why there is this need for verification. So basically, as we already said, it's important to measure methane emissions. And operators will be required to actually measure their operations emissions. So they will have to do it at the source level, and they will also have to do it at the site level. Then why is there actually a need to bring another level of empirical data to actually verify those reports? Well, there can be so many reasons for this. I've just listed a few here. There can be systematic error. Here's a very good schematic from Bridger, and technology provider that measures emissions in North America, where we see that systematic error will introduce bias, which can lead to lower estimates. For instance, there can be a lack of representativity of sites that are actually measured. There can be temporal variation of emissions. Just imagine that the operator here are measuring, let's say on this graph in October 2022, the emissions will be much lower than if they actually measured in July. So there needs to be some sort of this needs to be accounted for. And of course, there is also non-compliance from operators, which where they can just underreport emissions. Another few words on the fact that non-satellite independent data remains extremely valuable. Existing studies have been carried out in the EU as well. There has been measurement campaigns in Romania, in Poland, which are both regions of great interest when it comes to methane emissions from the fossil fuel industry. And those independent data can come in when satellites might actually lack coverage, for instance, or where satellites can struggle with detecting specific types of sources. Another thing is that those studies will give us ground level or airborne data. So ground level data, for instance, can give us source level specific insights on measured emissions. As we see on the graph on the left, we can note that from oil wells in Romania, a lot of the emissions were actually coming from open-ended lines. And this is something that satellites cannot tell us, since they just give us, emissions aggregated at a very, very large scale. And now the most interesting and exciting part, I would say, is that MethaneSat actually released its first data last weekend. We have here data for Turkmenistan and for a basin in the US. So 5 basins have had data already released, I believe. And yeah, just wanted to share this image here because I think it's extremely telling on the need for empirical measurement. Here's a comparison between the MethaneSat observations in dark purple and bottom-up inventories. And yeah, it shows how absolutely humongous the difference is and how crucial actual empirical measurements are. Another sneak peek on Tanager 1 data, which was also released here, is a plume that was from coal mining in Poland, fairly large plume of about 340 kilos per hour. So yeah, this is also coming our way. Yeah, and just to conclude, there is a lot of existing data sources on methane emissions, and satellites, for instance, and others will support the implementation of the regulation in so many ways. So an essential step is the verification of operator reports, as we said, to ensure their accuracy and lead to more targeted and efficient mitigation. And finally, global methane mitigation at the moment, not only in the EU, but also abroad, is now looking towards performance-based instruments such as intensity standards. And those instruments, it's very important to remember that, are not efficient if there is an accurate monitoring, basically. So this really highlights the need for monitoring and measurements to actually become a bit better and more accurate. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take questions. Not sure if we have time, and sorry, Mihai, if I went over time.
A little bit. If anybody has any burning questions, you can ask them now. And before that, maybe give you a little bit of time to think. I want to say that MethaneSat and Tanager 1 are very important, not only for governments and trying to implement the EU Methane Regulation, but also for NGOs like ourselves, because these observations from space can be verified on the ground, basically. And so we, as NGOs, we have maybe an informal role in this. But as you will see later on in my presentation, it can trigger some verifications on the part of competent authorities. So the fact that this data is made public, which wasn't a couple of even a year ago, we had IMEO and that's it, is very important. Will be very important for us for all the reasons that Elisabeth explained, but also for NGOs to try to sort of oversee and influence the whole process. Luca. Andras.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Well, I put my question into the chat. Maybe you can read it.
I can see it. So Hungary imports most of its oil and gas from Russia. Is it possible to determine the amount of total methane emissions relating to oil and gas consumption in Hungary, including the methane emissions in Russia? If yes, how can this be done?
MethaneSat will have targets on Russia, of course, because it's very high producing regions. I think the subtlety here is that, MethaneSat is looking at specific basins or sub-basins, and it is also crucial to know from which, basin or sub-basin the imports are coming from. But that is part of the EU methane requirements on importers. They will need to actually provide their member state with the location of production of the oil and gas imports that they're bringing onto the EU market. So normally it should actually be possible, combining MethaneSat data along with this information on the specific location of the production of the imports to Hungary. It should absolutely be possible, yes.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into our next presentation. I wanted to introduce you Brandon Locke. He will talk to us about oil and gas, the oil and gas provision, but also about imports. Over to you, Brandon.
Thanks for the introduction, Mihai. And I think I can be more concise than I had anticipated because so many great points have already been made. Maybe just a quick introduction. My name's Brandon Locke. I'm the Europe Policy Manager at CATF, at Clean Air Task Force. We're an international climate NGO. We've been working on methane reductions in the energy sector for almost 2 decades now. And we work primarily on oil and gas, but are also starting to work increasingly more on agriculture and waste in Europe as well. So one of our biggest priorities for the past few years has been the EU Methane Regulation, and more specifically, really trying to understand the potential impact of a regulation that extended its scope to include fossil fuels outside of its borders. One of the main priorities we had last year was trying to put out a series of analyses to really understand the different economic and health and climate impacts. And I think I should just maybe run through some of these benefits for 2 seconds to give you a bit of context of why the import component is so important. So if we zoom out, you can see these two charts here show how most EU suppliers rank on a 0.2% equivalent threshold. And you can see Norway and the UK are the only major gas suppliers with intensities below 0.2% for gas, and for crude, Norway is the only supplier. Raul already mentioned, the majority of our fossil fuels are coming from outside of the EU. So the ability to reduce some of these intensities outside of the EU is really where the lion's share of the potential emissions reductions for the methane regulation exist. We calculated it could potentially reduce about 20 more times emissions than just the domestic components alone. So I'm going to fly through what the actual obligations are, because Raul already touched on most of this, and Elisabeth as well. But essentially, the import obligations are constructed in a phased approach. And so what this is essentially doing is first establishing a way to get the data, to have access to this kind of methane emissions data. The second step is trying to establish a quality metric to make sure the data is more or less reliable. And then the third step is using that quality data to determine what the total maximum emissions threshold should be. So it's essentially building a foundation to make this intensity standard work effectively. And as Elisabeth just mentioned, if you don't have really solid data and monitoring, and you're confident in those emissions estimates, then it's very hard to enforce with credibility a maximum emissions threshold later down the line. So the first phase is the data reporting requirements, and a lot of this is quite simple. It's having importers, putting an obligation on importers to find out where the gas is coming from, what type of quantification or monitoring system was used to establish any kind of emissions estimate, and whether or not there are any abatement measures taking place. And why is this important? I think it's, again, going back to something Elisabeth touched on, it's really important to understand the context of the current situation for data reporting, which is really the wild, wild west, we like to say, when it comes to how we collect and analyze and actually transfer this data. At the moment, most importers do not have any of this information. They're not communicating with the exporters are not communicating with the producers. And so this is really an opportunity to build some of these bridges and make these supply chains actually transparent and establish what the estimated emissions are for different supply chains. And that's so critical for this performance intensity standard to actually work. You need to know where the gas is coming from, and you need to be able to establish some sort of emissions intensity to it. I think it's also important just to underline that this whole data reporting framework isn't just important for intensity. It's also extremely important for all of these targets that companies are putting out to actually have any sort of credibility. It's useful for secondary energy products like blue hydrogen, where you're increasingly seeing the life cycle analysis of the gas that is used be used as a metric to determine whether or not hydrogen is low carbon or low enough carbon for different types of subsidies. And then I think finally, just on this point, this idea of confidence and accountability when it comes to actually knowing what is the property of the gas you're buying is extremely important for any type of potential commercialization of these environmental attributes. which goes not just for gas and oil and coal, but also when you look more towards the financial sector, where there are opportunities for things like methane bonds and transition lending. All of this depends on a very solid data framework to know what were the emissions, were targets reached, or were they missed. So one of the biggest obstacles to the data reporting obligations that you may have already heard is that a lot of industry stakeholders have said for a very long time that we actually can't do this. We don't know where the gas is coming from because we can't track molecules in complex gas pipelines. It all gets mixed together. And one of the things that we are trying to make very clear is that there are already solutions to do this, essentially by following the money and not necessarily tracking specific molecules of gas, because it is true, you can actually buy gas opposite the flow of a pipeline because gas transmission operators usually try and optimize how gas is used to minimize the emissions and costs of transporting gas. So the idea is to just integrate, in the simplest terms, the environmental attributes of the gas with the sale and purchase agreement. So you connect those two, and every time the gas changes hands, you can follow it with the environmental attributes. And this is something that is already being done in the US, and it's something that the North American Energy Standards Board, NASB, has been actually working on for quite a few years. And so it's not a nascent idea, and we have the solutions to do this. Now I'm going to move quickly on to the second and third stages. The second stage is really evaluating, again, the quality of the data, and this is where all of these MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification frameworks come in to establish, was the data that was reported high enough quality for us to consider it accurate, based on the technology that was used, based on things like the temporal variation, based on whether or not you're actually reconciling different types of technologies, so measuring at the source versus measuring at a site or aerial level. The whole idea of this is to create a framework that gives you the confidence to say, we can trust these emissions. And basically, what the importer rules are saying are that from 2027, you have to meet the same MRV rules, data quality standards, for collecting and analyzing data as is set in the EU. And there's a few different ways they can meet this target or obligation by either having a national framework or doing it at the company level. So there's a few different options for companies to meet this equivalent standard, but essentially they do need to meet this obligation by January 2027. And the impacts of this is essentially leveling the playing field. I think it was mentioned earlier that we have a lot of these voluntary initiatives like OGMP, which essentially is a very comprehensive voluntary MRV framework where hundreds of companies are already doing these types of actions. The idea here is to level the playing field. So everyone has to follow the same rules, and it gives a really great opportunity for anyone in partner countries and also industry in partner countries to push for regulatory MRV frameworks. Because as I said before, if there's a national framework in place, all of the companies exporting from that country are exempt from the rules and don't have to do this reporting themselves. So it's a way to essentially incentivize these types of frameworks at a national level. And the second opportunity here is really creating this demand for consensus around global quantification standards. There's a lot of different ways of doing MRV at the technical level, and the idea here is to be able to create a broader consensus around what these standards should be. ISO is now working, the international standards bodies are working on a global quantification standard that the Commission will use as they further specify what exactly needs to be done. But this is an excellent opportunity to sort of build some global consensus around how this data should be measured and quantified and analyzed. And the last and the biggest, I should say, the most impactful element of the intent of the import standards is the intensity performance standard. This will come in several phases, but as I said, this is essentially setting the maximum limit of emissions per hydrocarbon output. So there's a lot of different ways of calculating this at the moment. And so what the Commission is going to actually do is create its own methodology for calculating methane intensity in 2027. It's going to require companies to start using this methodology and report in 2028. And then in 2029, it will set the maximum limits. And then in 2030, those limits will go into effect. And I just want to show you a very, looks like a very complicated slide on what methane intensity methodologies actually look like. As I said, there's a lot of different ways of calculating intensity methodology, but it's essentially, it's the metric that is used to calculate how much emissions were emitted based on the hydrocarbon output. And you can choose you can choose different numerators and denominators that would essentially give you different methane intensities based on whether, for example, you want to use the entire volume of marketed natural gas or the volume of produced natural gas in your denominator. The way that you create this methodology will determine ultimately how ambitious the methane intensity threshold would be, because there's a risk that you, for example, don't include certain types of assets that are mainly producing oil, and you can skew the figures in a way that would give a loophole to certain types of producers. And so creating this methodology in very simple terms is going to be fundamental to actually setting the thresholds that will be appropriate to reduce emissions. And the second to last slide I want to show, this goes back to the analysis we did before the methane regulation was actually passed, was looking at what would the impact of this methane performance intensity standard be. And what we did was we did a trade cost and price analysis using cost curves from Rystad up to 2040. And what we calculated actually was that if you used this 0.2% equivalent standard, you actually would have almost no major cost to exporters. I think they averaged at 7 cents per MMBTU, just because the marginal abatement costs are so low. Meaning, if you set even a nominal fee, it's much cheaper for the companies, exporting companies, to just abate their emissions rather than pay the fee. So it's a very small, inexpensive policy that can result in a massive amount of emissions. So it's really why we say, this is the lowest cost, most cost effective and fastest way to slow near-term warming, because for many companies, they can sell most of this gas that's captured if it's processed and sent to pipelines or market in the right way. So this is just a very quick summary. This is my last slide on what the opportunities are for the different stages of the import standards. I think I would just close by saying, this whole regulation, these 3 phases, it's extremely beneficial, not just for EU producers, because it's putting everyone more or less on the same field. It's really something that benefits, I think, the entire energy sector, fossil fuel energy sector, because it's bringing us out of that wild, wild west and creating these transparent global standards that is going to be used, I think, not just to reduce emissions, but also to create the kind of transparency and accountability that we actually need to start seeing, through different types of partnerships and commercial ventures and financial transactions. All of this is really coming down to transparency and accountability and improving that standard for data and making sure it's accessible. So I think that's a very quick summary of the import standards. It's a phased approach. It's something that we're going to continue to build, and we're working on a series of different white papers and analyses on these outstanding components. So it's very much a continuing conversation. But I think that's where I should leave it for a brief overview of what is the methane import standards. I'll hand back to you, Mihai.
Thanks, Brandon. I just wanted to flag for everybody that the specifications on imports are very important for the EU. Probably they're the most important because a lot of countries, let's say Lithuania, they don't really have oil and gas or coal production that needs to be monitored. So the European Union is importing most of its fossil fuels, and they are responsible for emissions at the source. So the import standard was very important, first of all, to fight for, because the European Commission didn't really want it in the regulation. And now that we have it, and it's very important. I would also like to ask Brandon very quickly, what could be improved in terms of the regulation, and are the provisions in terms of MRV and LDAR, which we didn't go into, enough? Because I'm asking this because we asked for more and we got a little bit less. So just like in a couple of minutes, can you give us an idea about that?
Yeah, I think the provisions on things like LDAR, venting and flaring, the more prescriptive provisions are really important, because that's the technology and solutions that we have now that we know work immediately. We've actually been using them for decades. Norway has had a ban on routine venting and flaring since some 1970, and that's part of why their emissions are so low, and they're by no means not a competitive player in the fossil fuel sector. So we have this technology, we know what works, and so getting those rules on the books, especially for EU producers, was extremely important. Now, the issue going back to how do these different types of provisions relate with intensity performance standards? How do those two things interconnect, and are they both needed? We would argue that it's better to have all of these rules on the books, especially because for things like performance intensity standards, we don't have the data available, and we certainly don't have enough quality data for those types of provisions to work. We need to build them, and that's why we have this phased approach with the import standard, which also applies to domestic producers. In the meantime, we need to be doing everything we can to reduce emissions with the solutions that we know work. And so I think that's why, having those routine bans on venting and flaring, LDAR, all of this, it's actually extremely critical as we work towards that point of building the clarity and credibility of the data.
All right. Thanks, Brandon. Thanks a lot. Now over to Sabina for something that I call, coal has been treated a little bit like the lesser brother in the EU Methane Regulation. But I'll let Sabina tell you why.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Mihai. Pleasure to be here. My name's Sabina Assan. I am a coal mine methane analyst at Ember, and I will talk to you about coal mine methane emissions and hopefully get you all excited about them. Right. So yes, I'm going to talk about the impact of coal mine methane and the potential for abatement, specifically obviously in the EU today. So I am going to cover what is coal mine methane and how big it is, because as Mihai alluded to, it's probably the most untalked about methane source, not just in the EU, also globally, but it is a big source and there's a lot we can do to mitigate it. So I will then cover the EU Methane Regulation on coal and what impact it might have in terms of emissions reductions, and then also go through a methane abatement case study and look at what Germany's been doing with its methane coming from its closed coal mines. So coal is dirtier than you think. I think most of us associate coal as a dirty fossil fuel because of the CO2 emissions associated when you burn it. But when we mine for coal, so during the extraction of coal, there is also a significant amount of methane which can be released. And this is because when coal is formed, methane is co-generated in the process. So as soon as you start mining for coal, disturbing the coal seams, this methane is then released to the atmosphere. The good news is that with coal mining, we actually know exactly where the emissions are occurring. And that is because in coal mining operations, for the coal mine to operate and to be able to extract coal, it has to be able to manage its methane and get the methane out of the mine, because methane inside the mine becomes an explosion risk. So the coal mine is constantly trying to remove the methane from the mine, especially in terms of an underground coal mine. And you'll see that most of the methane emissions will come here. It's in the middle of the diagram through what we call ventilation air shafts, and it's vented into the atmosphere. A coal mine can also try and take the methane out from the coal seam before they start mining, which would then be called drainage methane. But there's pretty much, these are the two main sources at an underground mine where methane would be being emitted. So we know where to locate these emissions. And we also know how to abate them. So the technology to abate these emissions has been around since the early 80s. There's really nothing new, and we can mitigate these emissions. And with underground coal mines especially, methane emissions continue even after coal mining has stopped. So even once all these carriages of coal are no longer in the coal mine, methane from the remaining coal seams will continue to seep into the old mine and the shafts, and will eventually make its way to the atmosphere if the coal mine is not closed properly. So how big are coal mine methane emissions in the EU? In the EU, methane from coal mines is the largest contributor to the energy sector emissions. So it is significant, and it is definitely one that we need to tackle head on. And who are the main culprits in the EU? I think we can see from this plot quite clearly Poland is responsible for most of these emissions, almost 2/3 of the EU's coal mine methane emissions. And that is because, as you can see, the big red bar, this is all emissions from Poland's deep, gassy underground coal mines, which are extracting thermal and coking coal, active coal mines. Romania, for example, comes in second, but even though it's got small coal production, you can see here that most of Romania's emissions are estimated to be coming from its abandoned, closed or abandoned mines. Yeah. And just something to always think about when looking at a plot like this: surface and abandoned mine methane emissions are just estimated using emission factors, which Elisabeth also mentioned cannot always be trusted, and especially these emissions have never really been verified by actual measurements. So that's why, for example, you'll see Germany at the bottom here, even though it has a very large amount of coal production, is estimating almost no emissions, because they use an emission factor for their surface coal mining much lower than what the rest of the EU uses. So there might be, there can always be some changes as to what's actually be emitting here and what's being reported. And just to highlight that, the IEA estimates that 56% of CMM from active mines can be mitigated. So almost 60% of that big red bar could be reduced if we wanted to. So the EU Methane Regulation, what is it saying for coal mines? I'm just going to talk through what the EU Methane Regulation says for mitigation. So it targets mitigation from active mines, and that's by saying the drainage methane stations can no longer vent methane, and thermal coal mines have a threshold on the amount of methane they can vent through those big ventilation shafts. But there is no regulation on active underground coal mines that mine coking coal. And so overall, we'll see in a minute that this is fairly low ambition from the EU in terms of mitigation. Then there's also a regulation on the closed and abandoned underground mines, and this is actually where the EU has said all venting, so all methane emissions from these mines are prohibited. And this is where we find actually the methane regulation has got some teeth and should be able to really cut methane emissions. So this is our estimate of what the EU methane regulations would actually do to coal mine methane emissions. And we found that it would reduce emissions by around 48% by 2031. So the first two bars, which is the ban on the methane from drainage stations and the threshold, the methane threshold. So this is what's on active coal mines, and you'll see really we're seeing very little reductions from active coal mines. Only around 10% of reductions are going to be required from the active coal mines. Then the next three, so the ones I've circled, is what's happening as EU countries are closing down some of their coal mines. Abandoned mine methane will increase, or close and abandoned mine methane will increase, but due to this ban on all methane from the closed underground mines, this is where we're going to see potentially big reductions in methane emissions. And this is really what's, for the coal, will be driving a methane emissions reductions. It's this ban on methane emissions from closed underground coal mines. So we're not allowed to emit methane from our closed coal mines anymore. What can we do? We don't need to look very far to see a very good use case, potentially the best use case in the world. We can look to Germany. And what you can see, I've plotted here on the left is their AMM, which is what we call the abandoned mine methane emissions from the 1990s. And you'll see that in the 2000s, this suddenly drops down almost to zero as they start capturing and using the methane from their abandoned coal mines in combined heat and power plants to produce power and produce heat. So this is, I guess, one of the perfect example of using this waste gas as something useful. And you'll see in the first 16 years, they already avoided 100 million tons of CO2 equivalent methane emissions. And I also found a figure, so for 2023, so this is off the plot, but even still in 2023, they're supplying 67,000 households with heat and 234,500 households with electricity, all from this mine gas. And this is from coal mines that have been closed a long, long time ago as well. So if the technology is there and we can do it, everyone should be doing it, right? Unfortunately, it's not the case. So this is just an example of Romania in 2019 only used 0.2% of its coal mine methane emissions from active underground coal mines. So that's the little red bar is what was used. And there's a whole lot of methane gas that is being emitted and wasted. So there is a big potential for reductions in a lot of countries still. There should be. So yeah, just to recap, coal mines are the EU's largest fossil fuel emitter. We need to tackle them head on. The IEA estimates that 58% of methane emissions from active mines can be mitigated. However, the EU regulation currently only mitigates around 10% of the methane from active mines. Therefore, mitigating methane from abandoned and closed coal mines is going to have the biggest influence on emissions reductions. So, for example, if all EU countries captured and utilized their AMM, this would reduce around 300,000 tons of methane per year, equivalent to 19% of the EU's total fossil fuel methane emissions. So a really big chunk. And the EU Methane Regulation must incentivize mitigation. So that's because the technology for mitigating active and abandoned mine methane has been available for decades. We've seen it in Germany. It really needs just the incentives, which in the case of the methane regulation is going to be setting appropriate penalties. And I'll leave it there.
All right. Thanks so much, Sabina. Does anyone have any questions? Apparently not. Oh, there's someone. Please.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this information. My question is about Romania. So what's the problem there? Why is methane not used on the technology that Germany, for example, uses?
Yeah, so for example, the reason that Germany in the 2000s, the reason that all of a sudden they started using this methane is because the methane from the abandoned mines, what they call mine gas, was included in their Renewable Energy Act. So there was some subsidies available if you were going to produce electricity and heat by capturing this gas. It's small, but it was enough to incentivize a lot of people or companies to go and start using that gas. And since then, they've been doing it. So it's really just about an initial incentive to get people or companies interested and yeah, motivated to capture the gas.
All right. Thanks, Sabina. Thanks again. We're going to go to the last presentation, which is actually mine. And I'm trying to bring it all under one umbrella, so to speak. And I want to say that most of the methane regulation is aimed at operators, right? But my presentation will focus on what the states have to do. And I try to imagine how this would look, the implementation of it, how it would look in Romania. And for this, I also want to acknowledge Rafael Epidia and Ecologic for, I'm going to share with you a very nice set of papers that details the provisions on implementation of the EU methane regulation. It is very useful for all of us NGOs, but also to member states. And also drawing inspiration from that, I try to apply it to Romania's case. Just a second. I can share my presentation. All right. I'm sorry. I'm working with two screens here, so it's going to be a little bit difficult. All right. So we're going to go through the key provisions to implementation from the point of view of member states. I'm going to try to be fast, so I'm going to leave some space for questions and discussion at the end because we're a little bit behind schedule. I'm going to quickly go through all of this here. So you have to know that we have, so there are certain things that you have to know. So we have responsible ministries at the member state level and competent authorities that will have to effectively monitor and implement monitor what operators are doing, set a governance framework for that, and apply penalties, but also look towards cooperation, incentivizing maybe operators, and addressing some challenges in implementation. So we've gone through this. I won't keep you too much on this. So the EU Methane Regulation that targets all the emissions in the energy sector, and that means oil, gas, and coal, and it includes imports. It also aligns with the EU 2030 climate goals and the Global Methane Pledge. In the case of Romania, as you've probably seen from also the other presentations, we have significant emissions from oil and gas production, but also from abandoned coal mines. We have a high number of abandoned oil and gas wells, which makes for a special provision in the EU Methane Regulation. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And Romania has the opportunity to integrate action on the EU Methane Regulation into national climate strategies and plans. Again, this is not only Romania, it pertains to most of the EU member states, but differently. So what are the roles of the responsible ministries and the competent authorities? Well, first of all, responsible ministries, they have to create and manage inventories of inactive and abandoned sites. That means that abandoned wells, for example, inactive or abandoned wells that don't belong to any operator, the responsible ministries will have to develop mitigation plans and assign parties for implementation at these abandoned sites. That means abandoned wells, but also abandoned or inactive coal mines. And they will have to establish, fund, and oversee the competent authorities. And the competent authorities will be actually those who will conduct inspections, which are both routine and non-routine inspections. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And analyze the reports submitted by operators and the mitigation plans that are submitted by the responsible ministries. So this goes a little bit back and forth. They will also have to enforce sanction, issue fines, address complaints, and ensure compliance in general with the European Methane Regulation. And that means compliance with its provisions in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verification, leak detection and repair, limiting on venting and flaring, which we wish were a ban on venting and flaring, but it's a good step up, and on imports. Looking at Romania, the potential governance framework would possibly look like this. So the Ministry of Environment would assume the overall coordination and policy settings, as well as the mitigation plans that we talked about for the inventories for the inactive and abandoned assets. And the Ministry of Energy would also look into policy setting and maybe liaison with the energy sector operators. Because in Romania, for example, the two biggest operators are state-owned companies. Also in the coal sector, it's a state-owned company, but that's oil and gas. So the biggest two oil and gas operators, state-owned companies, and the biggest coal operator is again a state-owned company. So the Ministry of Energy will play a role in this beyond its role in negotiating on the EU Methane Regulation at European level. In terms of competent authorities, there are several scenarios here for countries. In general, you can have one competent authority basically that takes care of it all. Of course, you will have to have the energy regulator because there is a provision in the EU Methane Regulation that no other competent authority you would choose could take its role. But generally, for Romania, you have these four different institutions which are responsible and might be responsible for different things as competent authorities overall. And I laid out a bit of the responsibilities, and the National Environmental Guard sort of because it already has this role of enforcement and inspections in environmental legislation in general, is the best set up to be to coordinate the whole process. The National Environmental Guard in Romania has county branches, so it will be able to focus on specific methane emission hotspots, because different countries have different methane emissions profiles, let's say, and more are oriented and geared towards oil, others for gas, others for coal. So you can strengthen these branches and provide them with the necessary know-how and tools to do enforcement and inspections. The National Mineral Resources Agency also has control and verification roles in general in Romania, and it also has a database for inactive and abandoned, the partial database for inactive and abandoned wells. And the Romanian Environmental Agency is generally in charge of inventories, but it's also in charge of monitoring and training. So it could train, National Environmental Guard officers in order for the National Environmental Guard to be effective in its enforcement. Okay, so what are the skills and capacity that are required by the competent authorities? Well, they have to have, of course, technical knowledge. So we talked about methane measuring technologies, and there are a few which we've also used, for example, in investigations in Romania, like FLIR cameras. These are not measurement technologies, but they are detection technologies with infrared. You also have, and Elisabeth talked a little bit about that, statistical methods to quantify CH4 from diverse data sources, including satellite, for example, or airplanes. And they need to know how to interpret satellite field level data. Here you will also have probably some institutions, like research institutions like National Aerospace Academy, for example, in Romania, INCAS, which has a airplane equipped with instruments that are, and they have the experience of detecting methane emissions in the field with that airplane. So the competent authority could collaborate, INCAS, or include it as since it's the National Institute as a competent authority. These let's say, competent authorities will also have to have different operational skills like IT, logistic management. This is fairly normal for implementing such a regulation. And for example, training CA personnel to use drones and mobile monitoring stations for site inspections, let's say in isolated regions. This is where these technical knowledge and skills comes in handy. The equipment that's needed, we talked a little bit about that, but we have detection equipment like infrared gas detectors. We have measurement devices for source and site level emissions. Companies already have these, a lot of them. And well, you can also acquire drones and vehicles equipped with sensors. The more equipment that you have, and especially trained to use it, the better you'll be at verifying these emissions, but also quantifying and establishing better emissions inventories, because right now they're just estimated. And because all of these can be a little bit expensive, Romania should leverage EU funding opportunities for initial investments. For example, apply for EU Horizon funding for mobile methane detection labs, but of course there are other opportunities out there, and Romania should also explore joint purchasing of equipment or potential outsourcing, because there can be a little bit of outsourcing, or maybe a little bit more, that can be done by the competent authorities or the responsible ministries, and then maybe seek synergies with neighboring countries like Hungary also has to implement the EU Methane Regulation. And as I said, these efforts, collaborative efforts, can reduce the cost of implementation and also improve inspection quality. Okay, so now for inspections, you have two types of inspections that the competent authority is responsible for. You have them here. So the routine inspections, they can be conducted every 3 years. and first round has to be completed by May 2026, so very limited time frame there. For routine inspections, the CA's role is to prioritize this in risk-based selection, considering, among others, infrastructure, the types of infrastructure, environmental health and safety risks. For non-routine inspections can be triggered by complaints or data anomalies. And this is where, for example, I was telling you earlier, NGOs like CATF, for example, come in because they have a FLIR camera. We've been working together for 3 years. We've been doing a lot of investigations on the field, and these could lead to complaints under the EU Methane Regulation. So in this case, complaints must be reviewed within 2 months, and they also have to answer back to us, let's say, who made the complaint, or whoever makes the complaint that concerns citizens. The complaints that are considered substantiated will be followed with inspections, and if breach is serious, another inspection must follow within 10 months of the first complaint that triggered the event. All right. So also the competent authority needs to analyze reports, that are coming in from operators. So it has to have the training to evaluate these reports in their completeness, and the mitigation plans that responsible ministries are in charge of. So the mitigation plans for the abandoned assets. The competent authorities also makes governance decisions on imposing sanctions for non-compliance and recommending mitigation measures for high-risk sites. And I gave here an example, reviewing an operator's methane data and issuing fines for false reporting, let's say. Now over to the responsible ministry's role. In Romania, and this is the implementation timeline that I put in here. So 4 countries that own over 40,000 inactive or abandoned wells, which is the case of Romania. There's a derogation within the EU Methane Regulation. And instead of just include 100% of sites by August 2025, so the inventory, the full inventory of their inactive and abandoned wells, they have to do 20% by 2025 and then increase incrementally to reach 100% in 2030. But by 2025, they have to include 100% of the inactive and abandoned mines inventories in these databases and communicate them to the Commission. And also, these databases have to contain methane measurements, and these have to be turned over by August 2026. Again, very limited time frame. So the responsible ministry prepares and updates the mitigation plans based on inventories, and the competent authorities reviews and publishes the mitigation plans, and this is recurrent every year. Romania, as well as other member states, have to establish a penalty framework. So in essence, penalties must be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. We have this in other regulations, so they need penalties in effect. They need to be a deterrent against methane emissions. Also, some considerations. So you can establish the level of fines by considering the social cost of methane, for example, or the penalty regime under the EU ETS, which is very well established already, and this would lead us to about 6,000 euros per ton of methane, for example, emitted. You can escalate penalties for repeated offenses, but you can also collaborate with compliant regulators to estimate cost of infringements and ensure that penalties are fair, and strengthen. And this is very important. You need to strengthen the competent authorities' independence and resource for enforcement in Romania. It's very important because the National Environmental Guard often has overlooked, like big environmental offenses. this is the implementation. This is how the implementation timeline would look for Romania. Again, want to reiterate that time is of the essence. And okay, so there might be some challenges. I try to identify a few. So like limited resources, which are usually is the case of let's say Eastern European states, maybe because not enough staff or not enough let's say financial resources. And that means and can be addressed by training competent authority staff on methane detection technologies and leverage EU funding, as I said earlier, and do a lot of front loading on investments. That you might have institutional overlap in the competent authority, maybe if you go with several institutions to establish the competent authority, and that means you need to clarify the institutional roles to prevent this overlap and inefficiencies, because inefficiencies means that you will be late with enforcement. Lack of operator awareness regarding the requirements is not the case with, at least in Romania, because we've discussed this at large, but always EU collaborations and shared data for enforcement strategies can always help. In terms of monitoring progress and to ensure long-term compliance, you need to send benchmarks for competent authorities' performance, publish progress reports on methane reduction, make them public, and adjust penalty frameworks based on the results. Also, in terms of collaboration opportunities, work with NGOs. Coming from an NGO, I think is very important, but also with academia. In Romania right now, there's a project that's evaluating emissions from inactive and abandoned wells. So that can also help the government, let's say, have in their inventories, have some emission thresholds for abandoned assets. Collaborate with neighboring countries, that always help, or at an international level, but also for joint monitoring, maybe equipment sharing. Engage with compliance operators for best practices. I know of one in Romania that has reached the OGMP gold standard. So the government can leverage their know-how. So in conclusion, because I've already exceeded my time, we need to decide fast on the structure and the governance structure. It will be very, very important because we have to communicate that to the Commission by February 2025 on the CA side, for example. Engaging NGOs, academia, and authorities in methane reduction efforts to ensure capacity, because we need everyone in this together, and that will help the government make better decisions in terms of implementing the regulation, and of course international cooperation that will ensure effective implementation. And I'll stop there. Thank you, and I hope we still have time for some questions. I went through this as fast as I could because, of course, there's a lot. Again, I will be able to share this presentation with you, but also I put a link to the ecologic papers in the chat. You can access that if you want a more thorough reading of the EU Methane Regulation. And I see we have gone over the time by 5 minutes already. So does anybody have any questions or comments? Let's hear them, because 35 people are still here. Yes, Lisa.
Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure where the complaint operators, on which side they are. I understood that companies can go there and complain about their penalties, their possible penalties, and then they get a fair process for the height of the penalties. But I don't get it, because I think the penalties are fair because the legislations are quite lower than we wanted them to, right?
Well, I can tell you, we had a case. We had a case in the in another regulation concerning F gases, which is another type of greenhouse gas. And in Romania, for example, so the regulation stipulated the same thing, that you have to have the right amount of penalties and the right level of penalties. And Romania didn't. They weren't dissuasive. Actually, on calculation, basically, we realized that illegal importers of F gases into the European Union were actually because Romania is also at the edge, so to speak. So a lot of illegal F gases were brought into Romania, and the penalties were not dissuasive. And when we calculated that, the illegal importers made a lot of even compensating for these penalties and fines, they made a lot of money off of selling illegal F gases in the EU. So that's not a given. But at the same time, as there is no, member states are responsible for this. There is no one size fits all. So you will need to adapt. That's why, in time, maybe penalties are either not enough or they harm the operators, which is not necessarily what we want. So as always, with any new thing, you need at some point to maybe review it and see if it's effective or it reaches the scope.
Okay, thank you.
Rafaela, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mihai, for quoting our studies. I put in the chat an even more comfortable link where you can click and find access directly to all of three of them. Indeed, a point on the penalty regime, we wrote a very detailed study on that, and that's, a regulation is always as strong as the sanctions it foresees. And I would like to say for the NGOs that are present here that that's a time to lobby for that, because every member state must adopt it by August, and it will be a complicated set of regulations. So they should be working on it by now. But also for the member states that might be here today, I don't know who is exactly if the penalty regime set at the national level doesn't comply with the quite detailed rules of the regulation, then the Commission and possibly even NGOs will be able to challenge it legally. So I think you better comply from the beginning. That will create security of investment for all operators, and everybody will know how they can and should behave.
Great, thanks so much, Rafael. Again, it doesn't not necessarily take a legal action. In Romania, we achieved to change the penalty regime on F gases just by lobbying the ministry. So it doesn't always have to go straight to that. But just so you know, you can always challenge it as NGOs. Any other questions or comments? I mean, we would welcome them. I know maybe a lot of stuff is very new to everybody, so just don't to a lot of people. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to come in and ask questions, because we've covered a lot of ground. Really a lot of ground. All right. If nobody has any more questions, thank you everybody for participating. I want to thank our speakers again for preparing these very detailed and very important presentations on this subject. I just want to say again that the EU Methane Regulation is the first step, and it just covers the EU methane emissions in terms of the energy sector, but we're slowly moving towards regulations and policies and measures in the other sectors, which are waste and agriculture. Just to give you, like an overview, agriculture is the most important sector at EU level and the hardest to demethanize, let's say. So if we want to achieve our targets also under the Paris Agreement 2030 targets, we have to deal with methane first, which has the largest potential to decarbonize our economies quickly and keep us into the 2 degrees Celsius, maybe keep us hopefully under the 2 Celsius target, if because the 1.5 is controversial right now. I'm not mentioning it. As I told Raul the other day, it's time to make 2 Celsius great again. So again, thank you everybody for being here. You can write us anytime if you have any questions. If you have questions for our other speakers, you can write me, and then I can pass it on to them. And we already have a big European community working on methane emissions. So hopefully some of you are inspired to come join us in one capacity or the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mihai. Thank you also to all the speakers. Then have a good day, everybody.